3 college seniors walked into the Cascade Wilderness in June 1999 with backpacks, a topographical map, and plans to celebrate their graduation. Only the map came back. When a logging crew discovered it tucked beneath a rotting stump 14 months later, the paper was stained with soil and moisture, but still legible. What made investigators pause wasn't the condition of the map. It was what had been drawn on it. Symbols that didn't match any known trail markers, annotations in handwriting that belonged to none of the missing hikers, and a single phrase written in tight, shaking letters along the eastern ridge: "They're already here." The families of Marcus Webb, Jennifer Salazar, and David Kowalski had spent over a year searching. They'd organized volunteer sweeps, hired private investigators, and pressured local authorities to expand the search radius. But the wilderness had swallowed their children whole. No campsite, no clothing, no distress signals, just silence, broken only by the wind through the pines. And then that map surfaced. It raised more questions than it answered. Who had marked it? What did the symbols mean? And why had it been hidden so deliberately? As if someone or something wanted it preserved, but not found too soon. The case became a media sensation for 3 weeks, then faded into obscurity. But for those who studied the map closely, who traced the strange markings and tried to decode the message, one thing became disturbingly clear. Whatever happened to those 3 friends didn't happen by accident. It was methodical, calculated. And it may have been waiting for them long before they ever set foot on that trail. So, if you're ready to descend into one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting, unsolved mysteries, hit that like button, drop a comment with your theory, and subscribe, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Marcus Webb had spent 4 years studying forestry at Everett State College, so when he suggested a 3-day backcountry trip to celebrate graduation, no one questioned his judgment. He'd grown up hiking the Cascades with his father, a retired park ranger who taught him how to read terrain, purify water, and navigate by compass when trails disappeared. Marcus wasn't reckless. He was the friend who triple-checked gear, who carried extra batteries, who memorized evacuation routes before every trip. Jennifer Salazar was the organized one. She'd coordinated the entire graduation weekend, cap and gown pickup, family dinner reservations, even a group photo session before the ceremony. The hiking trip was her idea of a reward, a chance to unplug before the chaos of job hunting and real life set in. She'd been accepted into a graduate program in environmental science and saw the trip as a symbolic goodbye to her undergraduate years. Her roommate later told investigators that Jennifer had packed 3 days early, laying out every item on her bed like a surgeon preparing instruments. David Kowalski was the wild card. Charismatic, spontaneous, and prone to last-minute decisions that somehow always worked out. He'd switched majors twice, dated half the theater department, and still managed to graduate with honors in communications. His parents described him as a golden retriever in human form, loyal, energetic, impossible not to love. He'd joined the trip on 48 hours' notice, borrowing a sleeping bag from his younger brother and buying a disposable camera at a gas station on the way out of town. The 3 had been inseparable since freshman orientation. Not romantically. There was never any tension there, just a rare, easy friendship that didn't require effort. They studied together, traveled together, and had already made plans to reunite every summer, no matter where life took them. The hiking trip was supposed to be the first of many traditions. They left campus on June 12th at dawn, driving Marcus's beat-up Ford Ranger toward the Skyline Trail System, a moderately trafficked network of paths that wound through old-growth forest and alpine meadows. The plan was simple. Hike in 6 miles to an established campsite near Crescent Lake, spend 2 nights, then hike out on the 15th. Marcus had filed a trip plan with the ranger station, noting their intended route and expected return. Everything was by the book. Jennifer's mother received a call from her daughter that first evening. The connection was scratchy. Cell service was spotty in the mountains, but Jennifer sounded happy. She mentioned the wildflowers, the clarity of the lake, the way the sunset turned the ridgeline gold. She said Marcus was making chili on the camp stove, and David was already complaining about sleeping on the ground. Normal, unremarkable, the kind of call that gets forgotten as soon as it ends. That was the last confirmed contact. When the three didn't return by the evening of June 15th, their families initially assumed a delayed start or a decision to stay an extra day. But when June 16th came and went with no word, the calls to the ranger station began. A search was initiated on the 17th. Rangers hiked to the Crescent Lake campsite and found it empty. No tent, no fire ring, no evidence anyone had been there recently. The discovery confused search coordinators. Marcus had specifically listed Crescent Lake in his trip plan. Volunteers combed popular trails for 2 weeks. Helicopters swept the canopy. Divers checked the lake. Cadaver dogs were brought in. But the scent trails led nowhere, dissipating in the dense underbrush like smoke. It was as if 3 people had simply evaporated. By August, the official search was scaled back. The families refused to accept it. They organized private search parties every weekend through the fall, printing flyers, offering rewards, begging anyone with information to come forward. And then, in late August of 2000, a logging crew working an access road 12 miles east of Crescent Lake made a discovery that reignited everything. The foreman noticed it first, a flash of color beneath a decaying stump his crew had just cleared. When he pulled it free, unfolding the damp, soil-caked paper, he realized it was a topographical map, one that had been heavily annotated. He radioed his supervisor, who contacted the county sheriff. Within hours, investigators were on site, photographing the map before carefully bagging it as evidence. The location itself was significant. The stump sat just off an old, unmaintained fire road that hadn't seen vehicle traffic in years. It wasn't a place hikers typically wandered. The map was identified within days. It belonged to Marcus Webb. His father confirmed it. He'd given Marcus that specific USGS quad map 2 Christmases prior, had even written a small inscription on the back. Stay safe, stay smart, love, Dad. But the annotations on the front of the map were not Marcus's. Forensic document examiners analyzed the markings. There were symbols, circles, triangles, and X's, scattered across the map in no obvious pattern. Some were drawn in pencil, others in what appeared to be charcoal or ash. Lines connected certain symbols, creating geometric shapes that didn't correspond to any known trails or landmarks. And there were notes, short, cryptic phrases written in tight, uneven script along the margins. Not what we thought. Heard it again. Closer. David says go back. M says no. And the one that investigators focused on immediately, they're already here. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The script was shaky, inconsistent, possibly written under stress or in poor lighting. It didn't definitively match any of the 3 missing hikers, though some letter forms resembled Jennifer's cursive style. The M mentioned in one annotation was assumed to be Marcus, but the context was unclear. Who were they? What had the group heard? And why had someone hidden the map so deliberately beneath a stump in such a remote location? The discovery location became the new focal point. Search teams returned to the area, concentrating on the region surrounding the fire road. The terrain was brutal. Steep ravines choked with Devil's Club, deadfall so thick it required machetes to penetrate, and visibility reduced to mere feet in the dense undergrowth. But again, nothing. No campsite remnants, no personal belongings, no human remains, just the map, isolated and inexplicable. Investigators attempted to decode the symbols. They consulted with local indigenous tribal leaders, wondering if the markings had cultural significance. They didn't. They brought in hikers and orienteering experts to see if the annotations represented some kind of navigation code. They didn't. One investigator, a former cryptanalyst, spent 3 weeks trying to find patterns in the placement of symbols. Nothing fit. The most disturbing detail emerged during microscopic analysis. Embedded in the paper fibers were biological materials, plant matter, soil, and something else. Eventually, they determined it was mucus. Human mucus, mixed with particulates consistent with wood ash and forest detritus. Someone had been breathing hard, possibly in cold conditions, their breath condensing on the map as they marked it. The timeline became crucial. The map had been exposed to the elements for an extended period. The staining and degradation suggested at least several months. But the stump it was hidden beneath had only recently toppled, likely during winter storms. Had someone placed it there before the stump fell? Or had they returned to that spot after the tree came down and deliberately tucked it into the hollow? Both scenarios were chilling. Jennifer's mother appeared on local news, holding a photocopy of the map, begging for information. The plea went viral in early internet forums, picked up by missing persons advocacy groups and amateur detectives. Theories proliferated. The group had encountered a dangerous individual. They'd stumbled onto something illegal. They'd become disoriented and turned on each other. One detail haunted the lead investigator. The phrase, "they're already here," wasn't written at the end of the annotations. It was somewhere in the middle, sandwiched between notes about hearing sounds and a reference to going back, which meant that even after writing those words, even after acknowledging that something was present, the group had continued. They hadn't turned back. They'd kept going, deeper into whatever they'd found, or whatever had found them. In October 2000, a specialized search team attempted to recreate the route implied by the map annotations. Using the symbols and notes as waypoints, they tried to determine where the group had actually traveled. It quickly became apparent that Marcus, Jennifer, and David had never gone to Crescent Lake. They'd veered off trail almost immediately. The first symbol, a circle with a dot in the center, corresponded to a location roughly 2 miles northeast of where the group's vehicle had been found at the Skyline trailhead. It marked a small clearing where several unofficial trails intersected. Evidence suggested the three had stopped there, a granola bar wrapper wedged between rocks, the brand confirmed as one Jennifer had purchased before the trip. From there, the route became erratic. The annotation suggested the group had moved through trackless forest, ascending a ridgeline that didn't appear on any recreational maps. The path they'd taken was extremely difficult, requiring scrambling over scree fields and navigating through dense timber. It wasn't the kind of terrain you traversed casually. It was the kind you took when you were either very confident or very desperate. The second major symbol, a triangle with a line through it, appeared on the map at a location 4 miles from the trailhead, perched on a ridge overlooking a nameless valley. The search team reached the spot and found something that made them radio for additional personnel. Carved into the bark of a massive Douglas fir were initials, MW, JS, DK, followed by a date, 6/13/99, the day after they'd started their hike. But there was something else. Beneath the initials, someone had carved a single word, wrong. The carving was fresh enough in 2000 that cambium was still visible in the cut marks. Forensic botanists estimated it had been made within the past year, consistent with the timeline. The word wrong was in the same style as the initials, suggesting it had been carved by one of the 3 missing hikers. But what did it mean? Wrong location? Wrong decision? Wrong direction? The search team pressed on, following the increasingly chaotic annotations. The symbols became more frequent, sometimes appearing only a quarter mile apart, as if whoever was marking the map was noting observations more urgently. One annotation simply read, 3 a.m., with no additional context. Another said, tracks, too large. Near a dense cluster of symbols, someone had written, don't separate. And then, later, we separated. The terrain became nearly impassable. The team encountered slopes so steep they required ropes, and thickets so dense they lost daylight even at midday. GPS data showed they were now over 8 miles from the nearest maintained trail in a section of national forest that saw virtually no human traffic. At the site corresponding to the final symbols on the map, the team made their most significant discovery. a shallow depression beneath an overhanging rock face contained evidence of a hasty camp, a torn section of nylon tent fabric, a broken camp stove, and a boot, size 11 men's, consistent with David Kowalski's known shoe size. The boot's laces were still tied. It appeared to have been pulled off forcefully, rather than removed normally. Forensic analysis of the campsite yielded confusing results. The tent fabric showed signs of being cut, not torn. The cuts were clean, deliberate, made from the inside. Someone had sliced their way out of the tent. The camp stove's fuel canister was still half full, but the stove itself was damaged. The metal twisted as if subjected to extreme heat or force. Perhaps most disturbing was what surrounded the campsite. In a rough circle, approximately 30 feet in diameter, the vegetation had been disturbed. Small branches broken at consistent heights, underbrush trampled in patterns that suggested movement, but not human movement. The wildlife forensics expert examined the site and delivered an assessment that no one wanted to hear. The disturbance pattern was consistent with a large animal circling the campsite repeatedly, but there were no claw marks, no scat, no tufts of fur. And the circling pattern was too deliberate, too geometric. Soil samples taken from the site contained high levels of adrenaline-laced urine, confirming that someone had been terrified. The chemistry suggested extreme fear maintained over an extended period. DNA testing confirmed the urine belonged to Jennifer Salazar. In November 2000, a hiker named Robert Talmadge contacted the sheriff's department with information he'd been sitting on for over a year. Talmadge, a retired surveyor who'd spent decades exploring the Cascades, explained that he'd been in the Skyline area in mid-June 1999 and had encountered 3 young people matching the description of the missing hikers. The encounter had bothered him ever since. Investigators interviewed Talmadge extensively. On June 13th, the same date carved into the tree, he'd been hiking an unmaintained ridge trail when he'd encountered Marcus, Jennifer, and David around midday. The 3 had seemed agitated, engaged in an intense discussion that stopped when they noticed him approaching. Talmadge described Marcus as defensive, Jennifer as frightened, and David as excited, almost manic. When Talmadge asked if they needed assistance, Marcus had curtly declined, stating they were fine and knew where they were going. But Jennifer had pulled Talmadge aside while the others were repacking their gear and asked him a strange question. "Have you ever heard sounds in these woods that don't match anything you recognize?" Talmadge had assumed she was referring to elk bugles or mountain lion screams, sounds that could be unnerving to the uninitiated. He'd tried to reassure her, but Jennifer had shaken her head. "No," she'd said. "Not animal sounds. Something else. Like singing, but wrong. The notes don't go where they should." Before Talmadge could respond, Marcus had called Jennifer back. David had said something about checking the next valley before dark, and the 3 had headed off trail, descending toward the nameless valley. Talmadge had watched them go, feeling uneasy, but ultimately deciding it wasn't his business. The detail about singing struck investigators as significant. They cross-referenced it with the map annotations and realized that one symbol, a spiral with radiating lines, appeared near the word sound written in the margin. Whatever Jennifer had heard, it had been important enough to mark. Investigators dug deeper into local history, searching for any reports of unusual phenomena in that region. What they found was a thin thread of strangeness, stretching back decades. In 1977, a solo hiker had reported hearing choral music coming from a valley where no trails existed. In 1984, a Forest Service employee had documented unexplained vocalizations in his incident report. In 1991, a search and rescue volunteer had mentioned hearing something like singing while searching for a lost child in the same general area. None of these reports had been taken seriously at the time, but the consistency was unsettling. All the reports described the sounds as structured, almost musical, but fundamentally wrong. notes that didn't follow conventional patterns, rhythms that felt deliberately disorienting. Talmadge also provided another crucial detail. When he'd encountered the 3 hikers, he'd noticed they were carrying additional gear, specifically multiple flashlights, and what appeared to be a large battery-powered lantern. For a daytime hike, it seemed excessive. When he'd commented on it, David had laughed and said they were prepared for a late night. The implication was that they'd planned to be out after dark, which contradicted the trip plan Marcus had filed with rangers. Investigators pulled phone records, specifically Jennifer's cell phone. While service had been intermittent, her phone had pinged 2 towers on the evening of June 12th. But here's what troubled investigators. Jennifer's phone had attempted to make a call at 11:47 p.m. on June 13th. The call hadn't connected due to insufficient signal, but the attempt was logged. The phone had tried multiple times over a 6-minute period, 11 attempts total. Whoever Jennifer was trying to call, she'd been desperately persistent. Her parents confirmed it hadn't been them. David's family hadn't received any attempted calls. Marcus didn't own a cell phone. So, who had Jennifer been trying to reach at midnight from a remote ridge miles off trail? The phone's final ping came at 2:14 a.m. on June 14th from a location even deeper into the wilderness. After that, nothing. Investigators also learned that 2 weeks before the trip, Marcus had checked out 3 books from the college library: Pacific Northwest Indigenous Folklore, Unexplained Disappearances in American Wilderness, and Acoustic Phenomena in Forest Environments. He'd never returned them. When investigators retrieved the books from his dorm room, they found extensive marginalia, notes in Marcus's handwriting, highlighting sections about singing rocks, luring sounds, and historical accounts of hikers who'd vanished after reporting unusual auditory experiences. David's computer revealed search history from the week before the trip. He'd visited multiple forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena, specifically threads about the Cascade Wilderness. One bookmarked thread was titled, "Has anyone else heard the humming in Sector 7?" David had posted a single question: "Can anyone confirm coordinates where this is most active?" He'd received 3 responses with rough locations. Investigators plotted them on a map. All 3 fell within a 5-mile radius of where the annotated map had been found. The picture emerging was troubling. Marcus, Jennifer, and David hadn't embarked on a casual graduation hike. They'd been searching for something specific. The trip wasn't recreational, it was an expedition. And they'd found what they were looking for. In early 2001, a retired forest ranger named Thomas Whitmore contacted investigators with information he believed was relevant. Whitmore had worked in the Cascade District for 38 years, retiring in 1995, and he had information he'd never officially reported. When investigators met with him, he presented them with a worn journal he'd kept during his tenure, specifically entries he'd suppressed. Whitmore explained that there was an unofficial policy among rangers in the 1970s and 80s to downplay certain types of reports. Not for sinister reasons, but because acknowledging them publicly would create panic and attract the wrong kind of attention. The reports he'd suppressed all shared a common thread. Experienced hikers would report hearing structured sounds in remote areas, followed by disorientation, followed by, in several cases, disappearance. Whitmore's journal documented 17 incidents between 1968 and 1994 that fit the pattern. The most detailed entry described a 1982 case involving 2 experienced mountaineers who'd radioed base camp on their second night, reporting harmonic sounds, direction unclear, possibly human origin. The radio log showed increasing distress in subsequent transmissions. The final message, delivered at 3:22 a.m., simply said, "We can see them now. There are so many." The mountaineers were never found. A search recovered their tent, abandoned and sliced open from the inside. Inside the tent was a cassette recorder. The tape had been running. Whitmore had kept a copy. Investigators listened to the tape. For the first hour, it was mundane. the wind, the rustle of fabric, occasional conversation. Then something changed. A low-frequency hum emerged, barely audible but persistent. It oscillated in a way that felt almost rhythmic, but refused to settle into any recognizable pattern. As the recording continued, the hum grew louder, more complex. Layers added, not quite harmonies, but something similar. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, then voices, not singing exactly, but vocalization that followed the tonal patterns. The voices didn't sound distressed. They sounded inviting. The two climbers could be heard stirring, one saying to the other, "Do you hear that? We should find them. They might need help." The other voice, more hesitant, "Something's wrong. That's not people." An argument ensued, then silence, then the sound of the tent being cut, fabric tearing, and footsteps crunching on snow. Moving away. The tape continued for another hour. The sounds remained. And then, faintly, horribly, one of the climbers could be heard in the distance, shouting, not words, just raw, animal terror. The sound cut off abruptly. The humming continued for another 10 minutes, then faded. Whitmore had submitted the tape to an audio forensics lab in 1983. The lab had returned inconclusive results, noting only that the sound frequencies were unusual, subsonic elements that shouldn't be audible to humans but somehow were, possibly through resonance effects in bone conduction. Investigators asked why he'd kept silent for so long. Whitmore's answer was simple. Because acknowledging it means accepting that there's something in those mountains we don't understand. Something that's been there longer than we have. Armed with Whitmore's journal, investigators began cross-referencing decades of missing persons cases in the Cascades. The pattern was undeniable. Clusters of disappearances in specific areas, all sharing common elements: experienced hikers, reports of unusual sounds, abandoned campsites with tents cut from the inside. The clusters appeared every few years, dormant periods followed by active periods. The area where Marcus, Jennifer, and David had ventured was at the center of one of the most active clusters. Between 1975 and 2000, 12 people had vanished within a 10-mile radius of where their annotated map was found. 12 people who had all reported hearing something before they disappeared. The case file on Marcus Webb, Jennifer Salazar, and David Kowalski remains open. No bodies have ever been recovered. No definitive evidence of their fate exists beyond the annotated map and the scattered evidence found at their final campsite. The investigation officially went cold in 2003, though occasional tips still trickle in. None have led anywhere. But among those who studied the case deeply, a theory emerged. Not provable, not comfortable, but consistent with the evidence. The sounds in the Cascade Wilderness, whatever their origin, act as a lure. They attract the curious, the confident, those who believe they can solve mysteries through logic and courage. The sounds exploit something fundamental in human psychology, the need to investigate, to help, to understand. Marcus, Jennifer, and David were exactly the kind of people the sounds would attract. Smart, capable, drawn to challenge. Marcus's research showed he'd been aware of the phenomenon, but awareness isn't immunity. The trip wasn't a graduation celebration. It was a hunt. And they'd been convinced they could succeed where others had failed. The map suggests they'd tracked the sounds methodically, marking locations, taking notes, trying to establish a pattern. The phrase, "they're already here," might not refer to entities at all. It might mean the sounds had already surrounded them, that they'd walked into the center of whatever created the phenomenon without realizing it. Multiple studies have shown that infrasound, frequencies below normal human hearing, can induce anxiety, disorientation, and compulsive behavior. If the sounds contained infrasonic elements, the three might have been driven forward against their better judgment. The circling pattern around their campsite remains unexplained. Something had moved around them repeatedly while they sheltered beneath that rock face. Whether it was attracted by their presence or actively preventing their escape, no one can say. But Jennifer's terror, captured in the chemical record of the soil, suggests they'd known they were trapped. The map being found 14 months later, hidden beneath a stump miles from their last confirmed location, poses its own questions. Did one of them escape the campsite, carrying the map as evidence, only to succumb later? Did they deliberately hide it, hoping it would eventually be discovered and serve as a warning? Or is there a more disturbing explanation that something else moved the map, placed it where it would eventually be found? In 2004, the Forest Service quietly erected small warning signs at several trailheads in the Skyline system. The signs don't mention the missing hikers or unusual sounds. They simply state, travel with companions, maintain verbal contact. If disoriented, stop and wait for rescue. Do not investigate unfamiliar sounds. The wording was carefully chosen, not alarming enough to generate questions, but specific enough to potentially save lives. Thomas Whitmore died in 2007. His journal was donated to a university archive where it remains accessible to researchers. Occasionally, someone discovers it, reads the entries, and begins asking questions. Most return with mundane explanations: wind, wildlife, acoustic anomalies. A handful come back disturbed, unwilling to discuss what they experienced. 2 never came back at all. The families of Marcus, Jennifer, and David hold memorial services every June. They've never had the closure of burial. They exist in the specific purgatory reserved for those whose loved ones simply vanished. Jennifer's mother started a foundation that provides search and rescue resources for national parks. It's her way of imposing meaning on meaninglessness. Marcus's father kept the map, the original, not a copy. He keeps it in a frame above his desk. The strange symbols and desperate annotations, a reminder that the wilderness keeps secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth. The question that haunts everyone who examines this case isn't really what happened. The broad strokes are clear enough. 3 people went looking for something they'd heard about. They found it. They documented it. And it consumed them. The real question is simpler and more terrible. How many others heard the sounds, turned back, and never reported it? And how many people right now are reading about this case and feeling that dangerous pull, the same curiosity that led Marcus to check out those library books, that made Jennifer ask a stranger about sounds in the forest? Because that's the insidious part. The phenomenon doesn't just exist in the wilderness. It exists in the telling. Every article written, every documentary produced, creates new potential victims. People who think they're different, smarter, better prepared. The detective who led the original investigation occasionally gives talks at law enforcement conferences. He never mentions the sounds, never references Whitmore's journal. He sticks to facts. But after his presentations, people sometimes approach him privately and ask what he really believes happened. His answer is always the same. I believe some places don't want to be understood, and the harder you try to understand them, the more dangerous they become. The case serves as a reminder that there are still blank spaces on our maps, not geographic blanks. Satellite imagery has eliminated those, but experiential blanks. Places where human understanding breaks down, where our models of reality fail to predict or explain what happens. Maybe the sounds in the Cascade Wilderness are exactly what they seem to be. Something inexplicable, something old, something that exists in the margins of human experience and occasionally reaches out and touches our world. Or maybe it's all explainable and we simply haven't assembled the pieces correctly yet. But until then, the warning signs stay posted. The stories continue to circulate. And every June, 3 families gather to remember their children who walked into the wilderness 25 years ago and never walked back out. Who left behind a map covered in strange symbols and desperate notes. Who heard something in the forest that compelled them forward against all survival instinct. Who learned, too late, that some invitations should never be accepted. If you're planning to hike in the Cascades, stay on marked trails. If you hear something that sounds like music where music shouldn't be, turn around. Don't investigate. Don't think you're the exception. Just turn around. The forest is still there, vast and patient and full of sounds that carry on the wind, and somewhere in its depths are answers that 3 friends spent their final days pursuing. Answers we may never find, answers that, if we're wise, we'll stop seeking. What do you think happened? Leave your theories in the comments, and subscribe for more stories from the dark corners of history. Stay safe out there.